So this next chapter that we're going to talk about is chapter 18, which deals with the origin and the history of life. So where did the first living things actually come from? How did that happen? Think about the fact that there's these crazy, complex things called human beings living on the earth, but they came from nothing. So how did that happen? So the first section is 18.1, which is the history of origins of life. So at the very heart of Darwin's theories about evolution and natural selection is the fact that all living things came from one common ancestor. And over time, that common ancestor went through changes in natural selection, and that led to the diversity of all life that we see today. So there's, we can refer to that common ancestor as the last universal common ancestor. So in theory, if we had enough evidence, we should be able to trace all life on Earth. So humans, dogs, cats, bananas, bacteria, everything back to one common ancestor. And that's what we're going to talk about. So Darwin didn't talk much about where life may have started, but he did hypothesize that it probably started in what he called a warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc. So he had this vision of this warm little pond, and that's where everything started. And then we'll find out he wasn't actually too far off. So we know about characteristics of living things way back in chapter 1, way back in regular biology. All living things reproduce, all living things obtain and use energy, all living things have a metabolism, all that kind of stuff. So those are all commonalities of living things, and all living things are made up of organic molecules, which we'll call biomolecules. So we're going to talk about today where the very first biomolecules came from and how that led into a cell. So your book talks about life being formed in 4 steps, starting with making just whatever chemicals are on the earth, somehow them becoming organic molecules. Remember, our organic molecules are things like amino acids and nucleotides and lipids. Are organic monomers, so the most simple organic molecules. And then somehow they had to join together and become organic polymers. And that's where we get DNA and RNA and proteins and carbohydrates and lipids. That's where we get those from. That's the second step. The third step is somehow these kind of had to start working together in what we call a protocell. And then finally that cell had the ability to replicate itself and basically be alive. And that's where, step 4, that's where living cells come in. So this image right here is out of your textbook. Oh, maybe it's not. Let me try that again. This image is out of your textbook. And it shows life being formed in 4 steps. And we call this abiogenesis. So it starts off with inorganic chemicals to small organic molecules to bigger organic molecules, then into the first protocell, like I said, finally into a cell, and then here comes the biological evolution that we've been talking about so far. So we start off with chemical evolution, changing of chemicals, and then eventually it leads into biological evolution, where the cells were actually starting to change. So let's move back down here. So the first step is the evolution of monomers. So somehow, based on the few things that were found on Earth's surface, we got organic molecules. And basically, one of the theories says that there was this environment on early Earth called the primordial soup. Basically, it means before everything, and it was just kind of this bunch of stuff, so it's called soup. And a couple of people hypothesized that, and then these 2 scientists named Miller and Urey carried out an experiment, and they found that they were able to support that with their experiment. So let's watch a video on that.
In the 1920s, Oparin and Haldane hypothesized that the atmosphere of the primitive Earth contained gases such as nitrogen, ammonia, methane, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and hydrogen. Oxygen did not become a part of the atmosphere until the advent of photosynthesis millions of years later. It was further hypothesized that under these conditions, organic molecules could be formed if there were a source of energy such as electricity from storms or ultraviolet radiation from the sun. In 1953, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey tested this hypothesis. They constructed a closed system with a reservoir for water, sampling ports, a chamber for the input of electrical energy, and a condenser to convert the water vapor back to a liquid. The researchers then added water, hydrogen gas, methane, carbon dioxide, ammonia, and nitrogen. The water was heated to form a vapor, and electrical sparks were generated to mimic lightning. This apparatus simulated the possible conditions of the early Earth. When the water was analyzed after 1 week, they found simple carbon compounds such as formaldehyde and hydrogen cyanide. These compounds then combined to produce formic acid, urea, and amino acids. In similar experiments carried out over the next several years, various organic compounds have been synthesized. These experiments showed that simple organic compounds, including the building blocks of proteins and other macromolecules, could be formed from gases present in the primitive atmosphere with the input of electrical energy.
So that's the Miller-Urey experiment. Basically, they simulated what they thought the early Earth was like. No oxygen, all those chemicals they talked about, and a source of heat or a source of energy, probably lightning. And from that, we got organic monomers. A second hypothesis is the iron-sulfur world hypothesis, and that was proposed by a gentleman named Gunther Walterschnauzer, must be German, and he proposed that there were all these thermal vents at the bottom of the Earth's oceans that were providing the heat energy, and there was iron and sulfur present there. And the iron and the sulfur acted as catalysts. Remember, an enzyme is a kind of catalyst. A catalyst is a molecule that allows reactions to happen. So the iron and the sulfur acted as catalysts, and they took all these chemicals that were leaving the thermal vents, so all those chemicals that we just talked about in the Miller-Urey experiment, and they acted as the catalysts for the organic monomers to be formed. So rather than heat energy from lightning, it was these catalysts that allowed it to happen. The last theory about the evolution of monomers is the extraterrestrial origins hypothesis, and it has been found that on meteorites that have hit the Earth, they have found organic molecules in those meteorites. And so some people hypothesize that that's where we got the molecules from. They came over on a meteorite. And some people even believe that bacteria evolved on a different planet and they got brought here on a meteorite, and that's where life started from. So now we have our organic monomers. We have some amino acids. We have very, very simple ones. So somehow they have to combine to make the polymers that we know that can do the jobs. And so one of those is, and the question is, how did this happen if there were no enzymes? Because remember, an enzyme is a complex organic molecule. It's a complex protein. How are these things going to happen? Most reactions never happen without enzymes. So how did it happen if there were no enzymes yet? And so again, we come back to the iron-sulfur world hypothesis. This also kind of explains it. And he says that these same conditions were good for taking the monomers that they made and combining them into be polymers. So the iron and the sulfur could still act as catalysts to make the polymers. Then another hypothesis is the protein-first hypothesis. And this suggests that, that amino acids can polymerize if they're provided with heat. So he thought that there would be a lot of amino acids in the ocean after they were made from whatever way, a lot of amino acids in the ocean, and they would get washed into shallow little ponds, and then they would be exposed to energy or heat energy from the sun. And with that heat energy, they would stack together and make a protein or a proteinoid, a small version of a protein, a small precursor to a protein. So that's what he thought, that the amino acids were able to self-polymerize due to heat from the sun. And this hypothesis says that proteins came first. And so that means that afterwards, the proteins acted as enzymes, which led to the creation of DNA and RNA. So the genetic code came after the creation of protein. So remember that it goes DNA, RNA, protein. We're talking about making proteins, but we have to figure out which one actually came first in the origin of the world. So that's the protein-first hypothesis. The RNA-first hypothesis suggests that RNA can act as both a substrate and an enzyme. So enzymes can act on RNA to make changes to it, like any enzyme would do, but RNA can also be an enzyme. Sometimes we have molecules of RNA called ribozymes. Maybe you remember this from when we talked about RNA, our small RNAs that can break down things. They can also act as enzymes. So it makes sense that maybe this came first. And also some viruses only have RNA. So that could be evidence for that as well. And so RNA could have carried out the evidence or the processes of life. So RNA might have come first. Then we have to talk about the protocell. And so a protocell, or protobiont as they're sometimes called, are a structure that are characterized by having an outer membrane. So having a membrane is very key to making a cell because we need to have a boundary between the inside and the outside. That way we can have reactions happen inside and we can be a living thing. So the advent of a membrane was very key to the later formation of cells. So basically, the original protocells had a membrane similar to what we see today, but they had very simple lipids because they just hadn't evolved into being the phospholipids that we see today, but they still had a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail, and they met together like this. So if you can tell, it looks very similar to what we have today, our current plasma membrane. And so these lipids would form together into something called a micelle. And so we can see that on here actually. So I'm always in the way. So here we have a micelle. This is a bunch of those primary lipids I was just talking about formed together. They just kind of tend to clump together because the tails are hydrophobic, so they hide from the water together. And so these little guys form micelles. Then a bunch of micelles, as we see right here, can kind of come together and form what we call a vesicle. You guys are familiar with vesicles. That's essentially what this is as well, except made out of the early lipids. So this would be, in theory, the very first cell membrane, right there, this little vesicle right here. Then, in some other experiments, a scientist discovered that if you took the lipids out of an egg yolk and put them into a suspension, they would automatically form a bubble, which makes sense, right? Because the tails are hiding from the water. And so he called these liposomes. Liposomes. And so these liposomes, they think that maybe these liposomes occurred because they occur naturally in a laboratory. These liposomes happened and then they engulfed enzymes. So now we have a membrane with enzymes inside, which is, in theory, the precursor to a cell. So this follows the membrane-first hypothesis, that the first cell had to have a plasma membrane before any of its other parts, because the plasma membrane needs to contain everything else. The enzymes need to be inside of there. The very last, nutrition of the first possible protocell. So they're talking about them maybe being heterotrophic, so they ingested organic compounds that they needed to survive to make the reactions happen. Maybe they were chemiotrophic, so they are living very close to these hydrothermal vents, remember? And so there's a lot of bacteria that live down currently. There's a lot of bacteria that live down in hydrothermal vents that are able to take inorganic molecules and convert them into organic molecules. Basically what photosynthesis does, except without the sun. They use chemicals instead. So maybe the protocells were not heterotrophic, they weren't autotrophic, they were chemotrophic. And then your book talks about how ATP, the process of using ATP must have evolved very early. So perhaps some ATP was just present in the universe, or in the early Earth, and those protocells started using it for energy. They would have pretty quickly had to find a way to evolve a process of recycling ADP back into ATP. Because think about it, as soon as they use the ATP, then it's all going to be gone if they're not making any. And so they think that the electron transport chain happened very, very early in life because it's the most efficient way to recycle those. So they think that the ATP and the electron transport chain evolved very early in life. Lastly, we have the evolution of a self-replicating system. Out of time, you'll have to wait for the next video for that one.